EU skeptics bucking support for Ukraine. Two elections in Eastern Europe question cohesion in NATO and the European Union. With Slovakia choosing a pro-Russian prime minister and Poland deciding whether to keep its right-wing Law and Justice Party. We'll ask why some of Europe's former Soviet states are sympathizing with Moscow and turning away from the EU. I'm Andrea Sankey, and this is The Newsmakers. Well, in spite of some polls predicting otherwise, Slovakians have elected Robert Fico as their prime minister. He's a familiar face in Slovakian politics. He served as PM until he was forced to step down in 2018 after a journalist investigating high-level corruption was murdered. But the clouds that murder cast over Fico seem to have cleared. His call to stop sending weapons to Ukraine resonated with voters who gave his Smer party almost a quarter of the total ballots. And now the EU and NATO are left wondering what to do with yet another member state turning against consensus.
On the weekend, Robert Fico, the three-time former prime minister and populist leader of the Smer SSD party, secured nearly a quarter of the votes in Slovakia's election. But this election also marks a notable change in the country's stance on the Russian-Ukraine war. Fico ran on a campaign with a stark promise to limit military aid to Ukraine.
Slovakia and people in Slovakia have bigger problems than dealing with Ukraine. That is all I want to say at the moment.
Ukraine says it respects the outcome of the election, but is waiting for Slovakia to pull together a coalition.
We respect the choice of the Slovak people, but it is too early to say how the election results will affect Slovakia's position. We need to wait for the formation of the coalition, and then, looking at the composition of this coalition, we can draw the first conclusions.
Bratislava has not been a major aid donor since the conflict began in February last year. But analysts predict a Fico government will mirror Hungary's stance and contribute to cracks in the pro-Ukraine alliance among the EU and NATO. Poland is also holding elections this month, and previously said it will no longer supply weapons over a dispute relating to Kiev's grain exports. Ukraine's greatest supporter, the United States, has committed more than $110 billion in military and economic support. But it threw out plans to give another $6 billion as it presided over federal spending over the weekend. Some lawmakers say the US should focus more on border security. Meanwhile, EU foreign ministers convened a historic meeting in Kiev on Monday to broadly reaffirm its unwavering commitment to Ukraine. But as the country's counter-offensive struggles to make substantial headway, how long will it be before more countries throw in the towel? Adam Amunu, The Newsmakers.
Well, in a minute, we'll discuss those upcoming Polish parliamentary elections and what's at stake there. But first, a look at Slovakia. Joining me now to debate where Fico's victory will take the EU, NATO, and unity over Ukraine are from Philadelphia. Sona Muzikarova, a political economist focusing on Central and Eastern Europe, as well as a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council. And from New York is Michael Rossi, a political science lecturer at Fordham University. Thanks all so much for being with me. Sona, I'll start with you. At least in Slovakia, we've actually seen exactly what you feared. You've called this really an erosion of post-communist democratization in Eastern Europe. Why should the EU, Ukraine, and the world as such be worried about men like Robert Fico leading Slovakia?
Yes, thank you very much for having me. So basically, Robert Fico is not, a newbie when it comes to politics. He knows his electorate very well, and we all thought he was more or less politically dead after his enmeshment in the killings of investigative journalists in 2018 and the fall of his government, and then the investigation that followed on his cabinet members, enmeshment with criminal groups, corruption, politicized judiciary, and so on and so forth. But he has managed to resurrect himself on anti-Ukrainian, anti-NATO, anti-American rhetoric. He really has tapped into the anti-establishment sentiments in his electoral base, and this is how he has managed to score points. Now the jury is out to what extent he will actually keep these words and this extreme rhetoric if he seizes the power, and this is still an if, because the coalition is in the process of being formed, and there are some options, several options on the table.
Right. First, let me ask you about this anti-establishment stance you said has won him these votes. Is that sympathy then? Is it turning away from Kiev? You know, this is like an anti-Ukraine stance. Is it sympathy turning away from Kiev and toward Moscow, or just away from Kiev? Are people just aggravated with what they've spent and invested in Ukraine when they feel now that it maybe wasn't deserved? Or do they actually see something in Putin's leadership that they aspire to?
Yeah, I think this is an interesting question, and I do believe it's actually both. Because if you think about it, Putin currently is a leading anti-Western figure, and to many anti-establishment voters, he has a great appeal. But also, according to research and surveys, actually there is a pervasive pro-Russian sentiment running in some currents of his electoral votes. So I would say it's both. People are tired to some extent, blaming Ukraine for some of their economic hardship, inflation, cost of living crisis, all of these externalities that have a root in Russia's invasion of Ukraine. But there also is an anti-establishment electoral base that is to a large extent pro-Russia, unfortunately.
It's fascinating because, Michael, you know, coming especially from the U.S., for decades, I feel that we especially were told that there was no way Eastern European countries, former Soviet states, would ever feel any sort of sympathy or admiration, especially for a leader that came from the former Soviet Union, especially one of Putin's ilk, that's, you know, former KGB. Yet, if you agree, as I see you nodding your head, that is how some Slovakians and other former Soviet states in the European Union now feel. They do sympathize with Russia. Is there a sense of nostalgia? What is that?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to speak with you. I don't think that there is as much of a pro-Russian sentiment as I think that there is an anti or a growing resentment with the neoliberal structure that is the European Union. I was just checking the news in Slovakia just before we spoke. Fico has said that there is not going to be much changes as far as Slovakia's foreign policy is concerned, and I think that this is a realistic reflection of the number of political parties that he has to work with in order to form a coalition. So his electoral rhetoric leading into the election had said things like no more money or weapons for Ukraine. And this is something that touches, a raw nerve of many Slovaks, as you said before, where there is, I think, a fatigue for the war in Ukraine. Now, whether this translates into pro-Russian sentiment or pro-Putin sentiments, I think is a small percentage of that population. But to get back to the first part of your question, which sort of marvels at the idea that Central European countries, which we have in the academic world, we have long regarded as the model countries that transitioned away from single-party authoritarian rule and now seem to be favoring a type of illiberal, top-down, executive-heavy leadership like Putin is, I think, something that is still a residual effect from the last 30 years of transition. Slovakia is a small country. It is within the European Union. It's a member of NATO. So rhetoric is one thing, actions are something else. And I believe that we may see a change, slight change, in Slovakia's foreign policy, but as far as a complete emulation of what is coming out of Russia, I would be very surprised to see.
Okay. Sona, let me ask you, I mean, was one of the elements here the fact that Slovakia was one of the biggest suppliers of Ukraine when it came to weaponry? I mean, I read one statistic that said Slovakia provided even more than even Canada, which is a huge, G7 country. Is that potentially what backfired, that the support just went too far?
No, I wouldn't say so. I mean, you are right that Slovakia, in terms of share of GDP and in terms of military support, humanitarian support, financial support, so all of the support combined was pretty high up. Actually, many of the eastern flank countries but we also have to kind of think about what was provided. Slovakia has had a large stock of largely obsolete, post-Soviet weapons that were provided to Ukraine, but I don't think this really was the culprit. There is a large gap and something to be recognized, that some of these things that Fico has said were done to score political points, but in terms of what is going to happen on foreign policy orientation, I think that's a whole of a new story, and it has been alluded to. Also, he's in a kind of a tough situation, because who is the kingmaker here is the third party, Voice Social Democracy, led by Peter Pellegrini, and he will decide, because both of the first parties, the Progressive Slovakia and Fico, will need Pellegrini to form a coalition with him. And he also may act as a very good backdrop, even if he forges a coalition with Fico, for foreign policy not to take a rapid and a stark turnaround. And I think he will be, a counterweight to this end.
Final question for both of you, Michael. I mean, seeing what happened in Slovakia, where does this all leave NATO and the EU? And will we see other nations more and more start to snowball and turn against Ukraine?
I think that this is certainly a sign that a good chunk of the European electorate is sort of becoming tired of being part of what they see is a proxy war between the United States and Russia. Their economies have certainly been affected by the sanctions. The pressure from the European Union to import Ukrainian grain has certainly touched a raw nerve. I know definitely in Poland as well as Slovakia, there have been declarations of boycotting, of blocking the entry of the grain as a way of promoting local businesses, local agriculture. So this is a reality check, certainly. Do I see Fico becoming the next Orban? No. But what I do see is Slovakia, Poland, among others, reflecting, I think, the changing attitudes among many that the war in Ukraine just does not have any end goal at the moment. It's just a money pit for many taxpayers, and they are voting effectively for an anti-establishment candidate. Fico has his history, make no mistake about it, but I would say that a vote for Fico is largely a protest vote.
Okay. Sona, your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I have to say I agree largely. Surging populism is not something that's unique to the region of Central and Eastern Europe. We have seen a pervasive rise of populism all across Europe. We see it in Germany. We see it in other large economies in the EU. I think to a large extent, populism is about offering easy solutions to common people. And I think maybe some of the...
Will it erode NATO and the EU, though, as a result, whatever the causes?
As for Slovakia?
No, I mean, will NATO and the EU suffer as an organization, whatever the causes of why Slovakia and the other countries are doing what they're doing? Will this hurt NATO and the EU?
No, I don't think for Slovakia per se it will erode, the unity on NATO and the European Union, but also there is a fine balancing between local interests and European and Western interests to be done both domestically, and it may prove later down the line, increasingly more difficult to keep the unity going. So basically, domestic politicians also have to do a better job in communicating what they're doing in these Western fora domestically to common electorates to basically earn their support.
Okay, Sona, that will be the final word. I'd like to thank you both so much for joining me on this segment of the Newsmakers. Greatly appreciated. Well, let's move north of the Slovakian border now, where Poland, once considered Ukraine's best friend, has now said it will also stop supplying weapons to its neighbor. Poles have been angered by an EU policy that favors Ukrainian grain exports over other EU states. Poland, Slovakia, and Hungary chose to ban Ukrainian grain to boost their own agriculture, which led Kiev to say it will report Poland to the WTO for illegal protectionist measures. Brussels is now keenly watching the Polish opposition led by former European Council President Donald Tusk, who packed the streets of Warsaw with demonstrations, pitting pro-European parties against the ruling nationalists bidding for a third term in office. So on October 15th, Poles will vote in closely watched parliamentary elections, deciding on issues similar to what Slovakians considered, not least Poland's position on Ukraine. Well, joining me now to talk about what's at stake in that election are, from Krakow, journalist Marcin Makowski, and from Warsaw, Renata Mienkowska-Norkiene, a political scientist at the University of Warsaw. Thanks both so much for being with me. We can't really predict the outcome of this election, but we do know going into it that Poland was one of the most supportive countries of Ukraine, and now we're seeing it turn away from Kiev. Marcin, it's not really just fatigue, but real grievances in Poland's case. So why have Poles turned, and could it have been prevented?
I disagree with the statement that Poles turned against Ukraine, because when we assess that statement only from the perspective of the society, we cannot see any kind of shift toward positive.
Would it have been more correct to say not all, but some Poles have? Because we know they're angry about the grain deal, and the government has taken a serious position on that, and it has changed Poland's policy toward Ukraine.
This is an issue of political and public debate. We see that fatigue is working everywhere else, especially in the United States, regarding what Republican politicians are saying. But how it started, this is the real question. And it started in New York, in United Nations Summit, when President Zelensky was accusing, not directly, but indirectly, Poland of being an actor in a stage that is set up by Moscow. And he was referring to the grain embargo, not the transit roads from Poland to the rest of the Europe, but embargo to sell the Ukrainian grain in Poland, which is a threat to Polish farmers. They cannot compete with the agriculture that is in Ukraine and have a different scale. And from that point, everything escalated. And Polish government, maybe also because of the election going on, and seeing the views of people on the street that were angry for being accused of being an actor of Russian theater after helping for so long. So the position toward Ukraine shifted, but it wasn't only because Poland changed its mind. We also need to see some gratitude, as UK defense minister said in NATO summit in Vilnius, and it works in every country, especially in Poland, when Poland gave as much as 40% of, for example, is tank stockpile, and we used our even line equipment, the very new one, to send them on the battlefield in Ukraine. And after so much that Poland did to Ukraine, we could assume that at least when we have attention, it will be resolved in diplomatical issues, not in open debate in New York in United Nations Summit. So that's why the views toward Ukraine is changing a little bit, but not maybe from the perspective of common Poles, but from the political sides.
Okay. Renata, are you on the same page there? And Let me ask you, I mean, if President Zelensky had not said what he said about embargoing Ukrainian grain, meaning you are standing on the side of Russia, would we be seeing this kind of animosity against Kiev? What's your take on that?
Absolutely, yes. I mean, it hasn't started by President Zelensky saying that. This was the answer to what had actually been done by the Polish side. So the Polish side actually maintained the embargo that the European Union has actually taken away. So it basically means that President Zelensky, and I want to underline it really, being a sort of desperate, his country has been facing for such a long time war, which, by the way, means for Poland, who indeed has shared a lot of military resources with Ukraine, but this means that actually it's the Ukrainians who defend not only their own security and safety, but also the Polish one. So I wouldn't say that it began with the statement of President Zelensky. No, it definitely began with the maintenance of the embargo that Poland could have actually suppressed. Now, why embargo was continued? Well, and it has been continued because there are elections in Poland. That's one of the reasons. Second reason is because in such countries as Poland, Hungary, Slovakia, although Slovakia, as far as I'm aware, has actually launched some more constructive debates and negotiations with Ukraine, like Romania, despite, of course, the situation, political situation, which we know it may change in Slovakia because Roberto Fico has actually won the elections. But those countries which are usually, I would say, quite populist and also where the societies are polarized, these are the countries which do play the security and safety card in the elections, which obviously for the societies is extremely dangerous. And Poland has exactly done that. I mean, not Poland as such, but of course the Polish authorities. So let's not put the answer of President Zelensky to what Poland had done as the reason for everything and actually the basic thing.
Fair enough.
It's not true.
Marcin, you know, some analysts have said that in another way, the tide is turning in Poland against now Poland's Law and Justice Party, as we've seen on the streets in rallies like those, especially led by opposition leader Donald Tusk. I know that's Renata's hope, but it seems that the entire Visegrad group seems to have actually turned Eurosceptic and more nationalist. So I'll let you explain then what you think has happened there. These are countries that have benefited greatly, actually, from joining the European Union. And why are they so, in Poland as well, unhappy now?
The country is not unhappy as a whole. Maybe some political parties are unhappy, or at least they try to present the situation as being more independent inside the European Union, especially when we see those kind of disputes like grain embargo, which is also part of European Union free trade system. And why is that? Because European Union is also a political body which has its own interests or agenda. And for politicians that are more into the right side of the political spectrum, those agendas are not usually the similar or coherent with their views of, for example, over the family, over the church, or over the sovereign state and their role in the European Union as a larger body. But one thing also regarding to what my interlocutor said before, which I strongly disagree, is that we cannot, and maybe this is also the answer for the question why the independent interest of the states when they collide with each other, and how we should choose which one is more important. Because for Poland, the situation with grain was not very clear, because we need to defend Polish farmers, and it was not only dispute about what should we do in the European Union as a body, but what should we do in our own country to protect our own interest over our own farmers. In Ukraine, the farming market is created around the oligarchical system and a very large structure of fields that are owned by oligarchs. And when we see the structure of the Polish farmers, there's small individual units which cannot compete with the prices that have been put from the Ukraine in Poland. So
Okay.
why should we even discuss about the blame of Poland when it needs to protect its own interest? Because it's not always so clear. It's not always political. Sometimes it's above the politics, in my opinion.
Okay. Renata, I would love to give you a
I
final
do.
word. I know you completely disagree with just about everything you
Absolutely.
heard there. But we're going to have to pick up this conversation probably after the election. We'll see how it turns out. But I'd like to thank you in the meantime so much, both of you, for being with me on this edition of The Newsmakers, and thank our viewers for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on X, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.